Hello and welcome to episode 11 of COP28 Covered, the most listened to climate podcast of the moment, brought to you by the award-winning ED content team out here in Dubai. ED's publisher Luke Nichols here on the beach to take us through all the twists and turns of the last 24 hours from the UN's climate summit. And yes, you heard that correctly, I'm currently sat with my feet up on a sun lounger recording this episode. More on that in a moment. But it has been a huge day of climate activity in and around COP28, which is now reaching the crucial final negotiation stages. The last theme day of this COP is one of the most important of them all in food, agriculture and water. And so Sarah and I are going to be digging deep into the topic with a trio of excellent interviews to bring you with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, PepsiCo and ProVeg International. Plus, Matt's back. Not here with me in person on the beach, but we're going to be connecting into him remotely back in the UK to give us his rendition of what's hot and what's not from the day's announcements, along with some fun facts about this COP as the climate circus here begins to draw to a close. All of that and more coming up in today's episode of COP28 Covered. Yes, welcome back to COP28 Covered, hosted in collaboration with the UN's Race to Zero campaign. I hope everyone had a fun and productive weekend, whether you were here at COP or back home. Or maybe you were like me right now, putting your feet up with a fancy cocktail on a sun lounger, topping up your pre-Christmas tan. I should explain, because today, Sunday the 10th of December, is my last day out here in Dubai, and I've actually got a plane to catch in just a couple of hours from now. I've had to vacate the Airbnb, but for my last few hours here, I thought, why not combine two of my favourite pastimes of podcasting and beach daying, because literally just a 1-minute walk from the ED Airbnb here is the famous JBR beach, which stretches almost 2 kilometres along the shoreline here with loads of restaurants, bars and of course that giant Ferris wheel that me, Matt and Sarah never actually got to go on. I do happen to have some local currency which needs using up, so maybe I'll venture onto the big wheel before departing. But before all of that, I'm excited to bring you this final live on the ground episode of COP28 Covered as we approach the nail-biting final stages of this year's summit. Now, as I mentioned, the final official theme of this COP has been that of food, agriculture and water, and there have been several big announcements made and big discussions had across the blue zone and the green zone over the past 24 hours, all connected by that theme of shifting to more sustainable, climate positive food and agricultural systems. Food production is of course responsible for over a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions now, so this was arguably one of the most important theme days of them all. So we've got 3 brilliant interviews to deliver up for you which will focus on this topic, but also given that we're now sitting or laying in my case on the cusp of an updated global climate agreement, we're going to make sure we round up all of the latest developments and announcements that have been made at a higher level to take stock of exactly where things are at right now. And I'm going to start there actually and do something that I haven't been able to do in 11 episodes of this podcast, which is to hand over to ED's content editor Matt Mace, because Sarah is taking a very well-deserved day off today, which means our popular What's Hot and What's Not segment falls to the hands of Matt, who listeners will know didn't exactly live his best life out here in Dubai because he fell ill on the second day. So we're going to hear from Matt now to give us his run through of all the big COP announcements from the past 24 hours, and hopefully, Matt, you've made a full recovery?
Thanks, Luke. Yes, I'm back on my feet and reporting on COP from the rain-drenched farmland of Sussex, and while the weather certainly isn't helping, I am feeling much better. And it's apt that I'm surrounded by farms in the countryside because Sunday at COP28 was themed on food, agriculture and water. There were plenty of unveilings in Dubai today, but the question I'm sure everyone is asking is, at COP, what was hot and what was not? Well, much like my fluctuating body temperature over the past week, what is hot at Dubai is also not. As is commonly the case with COPs, the announcements are broad and ambitious and generally do help to shift the dial and push the world toward a more climate resilient future. And that was evident today when the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization unveiled a sweeping 3-year programme to radically transform land use and food systems in a bid to eliminate hunger globally, while also aligning agriculture with the 1.5C pathway of the Paris Agreement. The framework itself is quite a mouthful. It's the Global Roadmap for Achieving Sustainable Development Goal 2 without breaching the 1.5C threshold, and it outlines more than 120 actions and milestones to transform food production to respond to the twin threats of the climate crisis and chronic hunger globally. The programme bids to deliver the Paris agreements while ensuring that SDG 2 Zero Hunger is delivered. And the FAO has introduced targets to reduce methane emissions from agri-food production and systems by 20 25% by 2030, and that's relative to 2020 levels, before then aiming to reach carbon neutrality by 2035. Long-term targets include transforming the sector into a net positive carbon sink by 2050, which would result in capturing 1.5 gigatons of emissions annually. So sounds good, right? Well, yes, but also no, because green groups have been providing us with their thoughts on this, and it's clear that this is just the starting point of what is quite an ambitious programme. So at COP29 next year, which is now confirmed to be located in Azerbaijan, the FAO will explore regional adaptation and financial options to support their roadmap, while at COP30 in Brazil, they'll outline investment and policy packages at a country level, noting that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to this. But green groups have moved to criticise the plan despite its ambitions in its current form. NGO Mighty Earth criticised the plan for failing to move global food systems away from meat and livestock, while ActionAid wants more, action on chemical fertilisers, factory farming and industrialised agriculture, all of which are major sources of emissions and deforestation. And unfortunately, the underbaked plans don't stop there. The COP28 presidency also unveiled its draft text for a global goal on adaptation today. Adaptation, as we all know, has often been a sticking point at previous COPs, but this new draft text lists 7 new adaptation targets which nations should strive to achieve by 2030. These are focused on climate-resilient food and agricultural production systems, improving health by mitigating climate impacts, improving resiliency, building and developing more resilient infrastructure, reducing poverty, safeguarding culture, and reducing the death toll from climate-related risks. Now, luckily, this is still a draft because green groups have been extremely vocal in the need for more clarity and ambition on this. So as we count down to Tuesday and the global stocktake, there is still a lot to be ironed out in Dubai. And speaking of ironing, I believe Luke is about to start packing all his shirts away before the trip back to the UK, so I'll hand back over to him on the beach.
Great stuff, thank you, Matt. And all of those announcements are once again covered on the ed.net website, and I believe we're going to be hearing from Matt again at the end of the show. Now let's crack on with it then, because this packed episode has got a triumvirate of business and food system themed interviews to bring you to tie in with today's COP theme. And I think to give me a bit more time to enjoy my cocktail here, I'm going to play these interviews for you back to back to back. And for 2 of these 3, we're going to be hearing from Sarah of Christmas Past, because she was able to pre-record these chats here at COP28 before she headed home. Now, Sarah's first one is a big one because she caught up with Grant Reed, who many listeners will know as he was the former chief executive of Mars Incorporated for around a decade, and he's now serving as the chair of the Sustainable Markets Initiative Agribusiness Task Force. The Sustainable Markets Initiative was launched back in 2020 by King Charles in his former role as the Prince of Wales, and it engages and challenges the public and private and philanthropic sectors to bring economic value in harmony with social and environmental sustainability. And then rather fittingly, we'll move on to Sarah's second interview, which is with one of the members of the Sustainable Markets Initiative's Agribusiness Task Force, that is PepsiCo, because she's going to be catching up with Jim Andrew, who is PepsiCo's Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer. And Sarah speaks with Jim about what real business leadership looks like coming into and out of this COP in the context of food system transformation. And then that brings us nicely onto our third interview of the 3, which is one of my own. As my last interview before leaving COP and coming out to the beach here was with Yasmine Dabu, who is the Chief Executive of ProVeg International. And ProVeg is a really cool food awareness organisation that is aiming to lead the charge with this food system transformation that we need, because its mission is to replace 50% of animal products globally with plant-based and cultivated foods by 2040. So I had a fascinating chat with Yasmine about what it will take to achieve that level of change. And I think that's it for the introduction. So let's get straight into it then. Here's Sarah's chats with Sustainable Market Initiative's Grant Reed and PepsiCo's Jim Andrew, followed by my chat with Yasmine from ProVeg.
Yes, so for this part of the podcast, I have found solace in the shade on the underpass of the Connect Conference Centre in the Green Zone, and it's great to be catching up with Grant Reed, former Chief Executive of Mars, now heading up work on the Agribusiness Task Force at the Sustainable Markets Initiative, SMI. Grant, thank you so much for taking the time today. How's your COP been so far?
Yeah, good. Hot, but it's been, I think, very productive so far. It's a great opportunity for us to meet with public-private philanthropy altogether. So far I think we're having good discussions.
Of course, and it's great to catch up with you as someone who now works across that nexus, but I did want to reflect on the private sector part. I'd be remiss not to mention that you were CEO at Mars for the best part of a decade, overseeing some really significant changes in the corporate sustainability agenda, including the launch of the Sustainable Generation Plan, which had a huge amount of finance behind it. So I wanted to get your reflections on how, in your time at Mars, the way that big businesses in food were approaching climate and nature really changed, because it seemed to be not just you guys but peers as well.
Yes, correct. So maybe I can take you on the journey that Mars had. So, Mars have 5 principles. One of them is mutuality, and then there's a letter actually back in 1947 from our owners that talks about the mutuality with all stakeholders, and that's customers, consumers, and the environment that we work in. So, it's not new for Mars to have that mutuality principle, and I think what we've seen, I used to be a procurement buyer for Mars globally, and it was based on commodity purchases of items, and I think the big shift we've seen over time is, one, a recognition that climate and social injustice in supply chains has to be solved, that they've moved then to, okay, how do we use science-based targets to say what was it we need to do our piece for the overall climate puzzle, for example, on greenhouse gases, and then working collaboratively together rather than trying to do everything individually. So, give you a couple of examples. I led the deforestation or reforestation group at the Consumer Goods Forum, working together to try and solve issues that nobody can do on their own. And now with the, as you mentioned, the SMI work, it's how do we now take that to the next level to really change the trajectory on regenerative agriculture and really make a difference.
Of course, and for those who are listening and maybe aren't aware of the SMI's Agribusiness Task Force, it would be great to also have reflections on that. So how did that come to be? How has it been growing during its existence?
Yeah, so probably about 3 years ago, His Royal Highness, then Prince of Wales, put together the SMI to be an organisation driven by private enterprise but working with philanthropy and public governments around the world. It's now grown to I think around 300 CEOs and 20 task force going after how do we really reverse the issues that we face in the environment around the world. And one of those, pleased to chair, is the Agribusiness Task Force for Regenerative Agriculture, and that's made up of key players from the industry. So we went in a vertical way, so everything from consumer companies like McCain, Mars, Mondelez, Pepsi, all the way through the supply chain to Bayer and Yara, and small companies, large companies, with a big focus of putting farmers first to say what is getting in the way of regenerative agriculture going further faster. Because as you're aware, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture. It's the largest employer, or one of the largest employers in the world, and 3/4 of the world's poor population are at risk and based on the resiliency of agriculture. And so if we can really change the trajectory, make it less extractive and make it more regenerative, then we can solve a lot of the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, something that struck with me from this task force is when it launched, it put out a report sort of tracking where we are. The headline estimate was that around 15% of cropland is managed regeneratively at the moment, but that this will need to be 40% or more by the end of the decade to keep the Paris Agreement in reach. So it was good to see the COP28 presidency launch an action agenda on regenerative landscape, so a concerted call from nations to increase regenerative agriculture hectares to the tune of 160 million hectares over more than 3 million farms this decade. So what do you make of that commitment, and what needs to happen next with that?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say what I'm really delighted about, my first COP was Glasgow, and given my Scottish background, maybe that's not a surprise, but there was very little talk of agriculture at that COP, and that's only 3 years ago. So the first thing I'd say is great, it's on their agenda, and they're making big commitments to go after this. So I think that's a big change. So I'd say that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So how do we take it even further with public, private working together to get to that 40%, 45%? I think is the minimum we need. It'd be great to go further, but I think the realisation is there's only 5 harvests to go by 2030. So we've really got to pick up the pace. We've really got to drive more change. But I think the benefits are there. It's well known, and you mentioned, the SMI's first document that we produced, and that was looking at what are the obstacles. Why is it only growing at 1 percentage point penetration a year? That's way too slow. And the big obstacle was there's no real metrics. There's too many metrics, if you like, for what is regenerative agriculture, how do you measure it? And where you have ambiguity, you lose speed, because people see more risk, they're not sure can they invest in it, what's the real return. And the second thing was really who's going to pay for the transition. Farmers are great business people. They love their land, they love their farms, but they can't afford to make that transition. So a lot of the discussions in previous COPs about energy transition, now we're talking about agricultural transition. That's a big breakthrough, and I'm excited by that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a few calls already to sort of combine the biodiversity and climate COP, and at biodiversity COP there was a look at what you mentioned, Grant, the finance, that at the moment farmers get paid to essentially do the wrong thing. So I'm sure we can't understate the importance of that.
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, what we've done now with the new report that's coming out, we said, what are the key levers? So we understood the obstacles in the last report, and it's not just about documents. We've probably got 4 or 5 million acres of work being done right now on regenerative agriculture with the groups that are part of the SMI task force, and we're doing that in 3 waves, if you like. The first is companies doing it on their own, wave 1, which is what I did when I was a procurement person at Mars. So a good example of that would be, say, the work Mars doing in Australia with Cool Soil initiative. The second wave is companies working together and partnering and collaborating. Good example of that in the UK would be McCain's working with McDonald's to try and create this sustainable McFries, I think they call it, right? So that's good, all great work. The next wave is the big one that we're talking about in the new document, is not only the vertical work, so far as I mentioned, from consumer all the way through, but also vertically to create a blended finance program that includes insurance to take out some of the risk of transition. It includes then banking to provide capital and money. It includes asset management, and it also includes consumers. That's the novel approach, because we've got to do 2 things, back to your point, which is we have to pay for the environmental outcomes versus yield. So what does that look like? It's how much carbon are we sequestering? How much less blue water are we using? How much less nitrogen is coming out of the crop and going into the water table, etc., and how much biodiversity. So we pay for those outcomes, then you can actually align the government policy, increase the knowledge base, increase the training. So it's private, public and philanthropy working together, but focused on outcomes, on environment and social that are really important.
Yeah, I think it's so important to keep an eye on the opportunities and the action as we deal with so many big warnings from the UN and other bodies about the risks. But Grant, just while I have you for a couple of more minutes, I wanted to come back to the fact that you mentioned His Majesty. He's been here and given a keynote speech, so I wanted to get your take on how that set the tone for what's to come for this COP.
I think so. One of the reasons I'm involved, I think His Majesty gave his first environmental speech when he's 21, so he was decades ahead of me. And I think the essence of his speech at this COP was exactly right. I think we're just not moving fast enough. We're just not getting enough traction. We need to move faster. We need more action, and I fundamentally agree with that. We're still moving too slowly. The current trajectory looks like we could be 3 degrees, not 1.5 degrees. And as I like to say, I might not be able to change the world, but I can help change my little bit of the world with the SMI task force and really make a difference. So, what I think His Majesty brings is that knowledge, first of all, passion, energy and bias for action, which I think we need, but also the convening power of his role and getting the right people in the right room to drive that change. And I think that's where this novel approach of blended finance, working together vertically and horizontally, can make a difference. But in essence, I would say he's absolutely right. We're not making enough progress.
Well, I couldn't think of a better note to end this chat on. Grant, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. It's nice talking to you.
So for this next part of the podcast, it's great to be catching up with a representative from one of the members of the SMI's Agri-Business Task Force. I'm here with Jim Andrew from PepsiCo. I have had to trek the entirety of the way from green to blue to be here, but we have found somewhere with air conditioning. So thank you kindly, A, for your time, and B, for the location choice, Jim.
Oh, great to be here. And yes, hopefully we get out of at least a little bit of the heat.
I know it is pretty brutal here during the day, but I was hoping to pick your brains on some reflections from what we've seen at COP so far. The presidency has been pretty keen to show a focus on food and nature already spearheading a big initiative on regenerative agriculture. So yeah, what are your reflections so far?
We're excited so far, and the reason is because for the first time, really, food agribusiness has really assumed a level of prominence in the discussions, both in terms of the importance of food and food security, its ability to help in the mitigation of some of the impacts of climate change, but also the impact that climate change is going to have on the food system. And so I think those things have now really gotten to, no pun intended, the center of the plate, and we're excited about that. Obviously, what really matters is how does it get turned into action?
Yeah, everyone's sort of waiting for these are great top-line commitments, what happens on the ground, and it'd be great to hear a little bit more about how that is working for your business.
We're, as you know, and we've talked before, regenerative agriculture is very important to PepsiCo. We touch about 7 million acres a year, and we have a goal to move that entire footprint to regenerative practices by 2030. So when the governments of the world start talking about regenerative agriculture in a meaningful way, start making commitments, start putting money against it, that's all for the good. Again, I think the real challenge, the real question is how does that translate into action in a way that really helps farmers around the world make the change, grow differently, be more resilient, and have the impact that we all know these practices can have, but really turn it into action on the ground.
And Grant talked earlier about how, in a way, parts of the private sector have been moving ahead of governments, like PepsiCo Positive was announced before we're here today. Other companies, including Danone, have made similarly big commitments. So what is the role of these companies being here and getting to meet with, you've mentioned governments, but you've also mentioned smallholder farmers. These are both communities that are here at the moment. So yeah, what is the role of businesses like yours at this COP?
We're hopeful that by being here and meeting with, as you said, a whole range of groups, we can both find additional partners, because we're all, this is something we can't do by ourselves. We're always looking for other organizations to partner with, as well as to maybe raise the message a little bit in terms of what is possible and how organizations such as ourselves can do even more if we can work with civil society, governments, and again, all of it starts with the farmer. And so how that really translates into action on the ground at the farm gate with the farmers is the most important thing. What we hope we can do is identify sources of funding, help influence the discussion maybe a little bit around policy. There's a whole set of things that are open questions around measurements, reporting, verification, and obviously at the end of the day, financing's a big part of it, and we've spent a lot of time here talking about financing for regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, that's something that we touched on earlier in this pod as well. And you've mentioned there's a lot of questions still remaining for the theme day on food and agriculture, so it would be great to get your sort of tick list, what you're really hoping for to see that day. We know we're getting a big new global report from the Food and Ag Association at the UN itself on climate mitigation, but what else do we need to see on this day?
The most important thing, I think, at this point is more detail. Taking a lot of great reports, and we're looking forward to this one, some big announcements, But at the end of the day, it's how does this all translate into action? And so details around that. Are more countries going to commit to putting agriculture quantitatively into their NDCs? Is there going to be more money pledged? Is there going to be more details on how some of the money that has been pledged is going to be spent and getting to farmers? I think really more detail is what we're hoping to get.
Yeah, you and me both. As a journalist, it's my job to be nosy about the details, so I should probably get back to reading those documents and picking those numbers. But Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, and very happy to continue to do what we can to help the world, in some small way, the role we play in helping to create a more regenerative, more sustainable food system that really, again, puts farmers at the center, is better for the planet, it's better for people, certainly better for our business, but really helps address the climate crisis, the water crisis, and food security. So we're excited to be here and do what we can in some small way to help advance that agenda.
Okay, yes, thanks to Sarah for those two interviews with the former Mars CEO there and PepsiCo. Here I am then, over in the green zone within the Expo City farm, which I have to say is one of my favourite spots here of this COP, mainly because it all just feels a bit calmer than the circus of the blue zone down the road. There's lots of greenery and wildlife. We're sat just next to a biofarm here. There's informal workshops taking place just near to us, and of course food outlets. And it's that last element that I think brings us to the basis of this particular conversation and this episode, because I'm delighted to be joined now by Yasmin Dibou, who is the Chief Executive of the UK-based not-for-profit ProVeg International. Yasmin, thank you for joining us. I must say this is one of my last live interviews for this series of the podcast before I head home, but it's also one that I've been looking forward to the most as someone who is very kind of pro-veg myself. And let's start there with ProVeg. Tell us a bit more about what the organisation does and what you stand for.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Like you, I really enjoy the green space around us here because, as you said, in the blue zone it's all people and buildings and not much green, so it's really tranquil here. So I'm the global CEO actually of ProVeg International, and we have a mission of replacing 50% of animal products with plant-based and cultivated alternatives by the year 2040. And that's quite a bold mission. We completely understand that, but it's also very concrete. And we know that we have to do this to stay within the 1.5 degree climate change temperature rise. So that's really important. Without the food element, we're not going to make it. And that's why we're here at COP. We are active in 12 countries at the moment, 13 very soon, and we have some of our country directors here at COP as well. Last week we had from South Africa and Nigeria, and this week also the Managing Director Asia, and our UN team of 4 people are also here for the 2 weeks to help with the various negotiations and all the Saudi events and all the press conferences. So I think we're really happy to be here as part of the Food for Climate Pavilion. And that's the second year running that we now have a pavilion with about 20 partners, food tanks, food think tanks and NGOs, companies coming together to discuss food system change.
Yeah, I was over at the Food for Climate Pavilion just yesterday for yesterday's episode. In fact, it's a great pavilion with loads of really interesting organisations there. And ProVeg, I guess, sits then at this really interesting intersection between food and agriculture and climate. And this is arguably one of the most important intersections for action at this COP. In fact, rather than arguably, it is one of the most important intersections. Numerous reports are showing how significant an impact a plant-based diet can have on the planet. Livestock emits around a third of the global output of methane. The famous Project Drawdown Climate Solutions Initiative now ranks plant-rich diets second in its list of solutions to keep warming within the 1.5 degree limit, more impactful even than the shift to renewables, reforestation. So we know that the switch to meat-free diets can reduce emissions significantly, by up to 3/4, in fact, compared with average meat-based diets. So the numbers are clear for all to see, but I would say this is arguably one of the biggest elephants in the rooms for everyone here, because it's quite clear that the shift to plant-based diets or even plant-rich diets isn't happening at the pace or scale required. So before I run away with the various facts and stats behind this, perhaps you in your own words, Yasmin, could underline why you see this as one of the critical issues coming into this COP.
Yes, as you said, it's an interconnected issue and it touches on so many things. Of course, the climate, but also people's own public health and individual health. It is also important for the justice element and the food distribution that we have in the world, which is just not a fair situation at the moment. And the actual intensive livestock system that we have has all these negative impacts on biodiversity, climate, people, animals, health. And that's why we're here, that intersection. As you said, those figures are so important and it's so neglected, and we need to really reduce significantly, and particularly where in countries there's overconsumption, like in the global north, in Europe, in North America. That's where we actually need to reduce 70, 80, 90% of our animal consumption and replace with plant-based and cultivated meat. It's quite a steep change, I think, and people are not ready for it, and we can see now that a lot of the dairy and meat lobby are here out in force and trying to stop everything. They can see that we're already heading that way. Some governments are starting to acknowledge that we need to reduce the animal consumption and that we need to eat more diversified protein. Germany is just the last country that announced 38 million euros for alternative proteins, so that's a great development. We know about Denmark, of course. There's a plan in South Korea, so it's becoming global. There's interest in this topic. But there's also very strong pushback, and I think we need to be bold, but at the same time also be pragmatic and work on solutions together. And we're not going to exclude other solutions, but just focusing on the regenerative and the techno fixes that kind of reduce the methane emissions by maybe 1% or whatever, or genetic diversification or feed conversions, I think are not going to make enough of an impact. So we have to reduce the actual consumption and eat more plant-based and cultivated meat in the future.
It is a really interesting kind of dichotomy here, the apparent ambitions coming into this kind of COP and actually what we're seeing in reality. I mean, I've been here in and out of these doors every day for over a week now, and from personal experience, I would say there is a real sort of struggle around this issue, because even before coming into this summit, the presidency said that they were going to be really kind of walking the walk on food system transformation. The COP website says they want to show the world how climate-friendly food can be tasty, healthy and affordable. And apparently 2/3 of the menus here are vegan or vegetarian. I'm not quite sure how they've kind of reached those numbers, having experienced it. But at the same time as all of that, as you say, Yasmine, we're seeing these reports emerge just earlier today, which have revealed that lobbyists from industrial agriculture companies and trade groups have turned out in record numbers here at COP28, with 3 times as many delegates representing the meat and dairy industry as last year. So what do you make of all of this, Yasmine? Do you feel that this COP is championing plant-based diets in the way that we need it to?
Not quite in the way that we need it to be, but if you compare to previous COPs, I think it's already a major change. Last year there was the food pavilion for the first time, but there was no food day at COP, so there was no official agenda. This year it will happen, so that's a good sign. Whether the actual plant-based options are 2/3 and whether people are actually consuming those plant-based options, I don't know. It would be very interesting, and I think we would like to find out more after COP what the actual volume was of what was being sold and the proportion between animal-based and plant-based. So that's one thing to follow up on after this. But in terms of declarations, we've seen a couple of declarations that were somewhat promising, the healthy diets one and the agriculture one, but we've now got the global stocktake, of course, and that's not mentioning food systems at all. And that's really worrying. So we do need to see a change in that final text. The last draft did not mention it, and I think that's really worrying. So these lobbyists probably do have an effect on that draft text, and I think that's really distorting the action that we need to take. And it really is out of the playbook from the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, delay tactics, changing the science, having spokespersons on social media that debunk all sorts of things about plant-based that are not true. And I think we need to be very mindful and work together. We had a good session this morning with industry leaders, startups and NGOs, talking about how we can collaborate to really strengthen that message, I think, and be united. Yes, behind closed doors there may be some discussions and arguments, but in front I think we need to really be united and focus on the potential. There's so much economic potential and growth and jobs, and there's a lot that people actually can do with protein diversification.
And on this point then about industrial agricultural companies and trade groups being here, I mean, some people are saying here that they're here to try and head off any kind of COP outcome that might hinder their operations, but others, I guess, perhaps less cynically might be feeling that those food and drink manufacturers do need to have a seat at the table here at this COP, discussing and sharing transparently how they themselves are going to transform their business models in line with climate science. Where do you stand on that more broadly, Yasmin? What role should food and drink firms be playing at this COP?
Yeah, I think they need to be open for solutions, and I think we've seen that from some of the bigger multinationals, and Unilever, Mars. They have actually put in place some sustainability plans that have transformed a lot already. But we should always be kind of looking at what impact it really has, because sometimes the solutions are more marginal and not really making enough progress. So I think we need to work on both pragmatic solutions that are, for farmers here and now, and also bringing the farmers along and showing them the potential of the plant-based and cultivated meat revolution. And that solution is already here. We can scale it up quite easily. We would actually already have enough food for everyone in the world to eat if we didn't feed it all to animals first, and then kind of lose a lot of energy and food through passing it through animals first. So I think it makes sense to focus on that solution. And the companies have a role to play in innovation. They have a role to play in regulatory kind of meetings with policymakers to make it more level playing field, because at the moment it's very distorted. The subsidies for animal agriculture are keeping those prices very low deliberately, whereas the plant-based products sometimes have to pay more VAT, and it's not a level playing field. So we need to work on all these different levels. Corporate have a role to play in that, and NGOs do too, and we can a lot of this can be done together.
So we talked big government, we talked big business. I want to kind of bring this back round now to an individual level, because yes, we have those big food and agri companies who may or may not have the best climate interests at heart. Yes, we have the governments here who can effectively, I guess, mandate these industries to change. But we also have tens of thousands of climate activists, sustainability and environmental leaders, and role models essentially here when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. But many of these people will come off of a stage or out of a high-level meeting, queue up here and then opt for a beef burger or some chicken nuggets when a tasty vegan choice is right there alongside it on the menu. And I can't help but feel like if these people, these change makers, can't walk the walk really and lead the plant-based revolution, which we all know is better for the planet, then what chance do we have for the wider kind of consumer base to drive change? Again, before I run away with this point, Yasmin, where do you stand on this? Should more personal responsibility be placed on individuals who work in this great industry of climate action to be plant-based?
Yeah, I think we need to, again, do everything. We need to show that we are walking the walk, and that means that the climate activists, the climate negotiators, all of them in the same space need to do some personal steps as well. And I think we've seen that with the energy transition, where more and more people are starting to move to hybrid or electrical vehicles, and that is the same kind of transition that we need to see now also. They have a role to play in being that kind of influencer, and people will follow. It's very important. We see that from kind of celebrities. They have a huge influence, and we need the actual climate negotiators, climate activists also to be part of that. And yeah, it's easier, as you say, nowadays. I was actually encouraged, I have to say. I was in a queue yesterday for Switch for Good, the local kind of meat burger and kafta, and the queue was enormous. It was like 45 minutes, and pretty much everyone there was like meat eaters. They were curious. They wanted to try it, so it was a good sign. I think that's where it starts: curiosity and willingness.
Completely, that's exactly where it started for me, was just being curious about it and willing to try it, and then quite quickly follows a sort of behavioural change, and only after a few weeks and then months, and then suddenly you can't quite realise how it took so long for you to individually make that change, right? Anyway, we've digressed quite a bit in this conversation away from the broader COP conversation, so just bringing this back round finally, Yasmin, to where we are sat now here within COP, just a couple of days remaining of these talks. What would a kind of good COP look like for you and for ProVeg in relation to everything we've been discussing? You mentioned like the text and what we need to include within it.
Yes, I think the global stocktake is a very important moment, because we need to see that food systems are acknowledging that the declarations I mentioned earlier will only be useful if they can actually be translated into national determined contributions and in national action plans. And if the global stocktake doesn't make any mention to something that causes 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, then we're really, as you said, not addressing the cow in the room or the elephant in the room, and that needs to be done. So we need to see something. So last minute appeal to all the negotiators from all the different countries, the leaders, to at least mention it once or twice as an important topic to address, and to follow on next year in Bonn and the next COP and the Brazil COP. I think we really need to start seeing action, because we don't actually have that long until 2030 when things might start to kind of shift in terms of tipping points, and we need to take action now.
Yeah, the cow in the room, I might have to steal that one. Thank you so much, Yasmine, for your time. I don't know about you, but it's just past lunchtime here and I've still not had a chance to eat anything myself, and this conversation's got me rather hungry, so I'm going to go out and see if I can enjoy some of the plant-based food options just around the corner. Hopefully there won't be a long queue. But Yasmine Deboo, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's been really enlightening.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here.
Yes, thank you very much to Grant, to Jim and to Yasmine there. That is food and agriculture well and truly covered on this episode of the pod. And that almost brings us to a close for this episode, but for that final special segment from none other than Edie's content editor Matt, who we heard from earlier on, because as we now reach the final countdown here in Dubai for COP28, it's about time that we start to reflect and recap on these monumental 2 weeks here at the summit. And one of the main things that I think needs reflecting on is the sheer size and scale and potential impacts of this year's COP, because it really has been a climate event like no other in history. But what were the big numbers and fun facts behind this COP that will impress friends back home, I hear you ask? Well, never fear, Matt is here, because he dropped me a note earlier to say he'd be delivering up his own take of Top of the COPs, which is a shameless title but actually works quite well here, so I'll give him that one. So for our final segment of the show, here's Matt's top facts and stats from COP28.
Right, so for this edition of Top of the COPs, I'm going to break down the numbers as they have emerged in Dubai over the last, almost 2 weeks now. And I'm going to be focusing in particular on finance and attendees. So let's start with the latter, the amount of people that were scheduled to show up at COP28. According to The Guardian, the UN's provisional list had about 84,000 participants scheduled to attend COP28. Of those, almost 2,500 are industry-affiliated lobbyists within the fossil fuel sector, and that's almost 4 times higher than the number that was registered for COP27 in Egypt last year. The Guardian also states that COP28 organisers granted attendance to almost 500 lobbyists working within the carbon capture sector, and that alone, just those 500 people, outnumber the official indigenous representatives by 50%, as well as some climate-affected countries, including Somalia, who had 366 official registered attendees, Tonga, just 79, Liberia, almost 200, and the Solomon Islands, which only had 56. So, as has often been the case with COPs, the oil and gas industry has kind of infiltrated its way in, but we are still hopeful that in the final text that won't influence as much the need for a phase out rather than a phase down. Moving on to official figures from the COP28 presidency themselves, they claim that so far the summit has mobilised more than $83 billion in climate investment. Obviously, across these first 10 days, there's been lots of different thematic focuses, and I'm going to try and break down the major commitments so far. So for loss and damage, funding now sits at $792 million. The Green Climate Fund has mobilised $3.5 billion. And they will increase to their second replenishment of $12.8 billion with future funding as well. Adaptation funds have generated $134 million of finance. There's also renewable energy announcements, which have been backed by $5 billion of funding. Cooling, we had that big kind of cooling pledge at the start of the week, a little less with $57 million. Clean cooking has got $30 million ring-fenced. Methane, to tackle methane, $1.2 billion now set aside. Climate finance kind of varies because it covers so many different of those thematic days, but there's been a $30 billion commitment from the UAE as a whole. Food systems have seen $3.1 billion ring-fenced. Nature, $2.6 billion. Health, $2.9 billion. Water, just $150 million. Gender, $2.8 million as well. So those are the big numbers so far at COP28.
Yeah, impressive stuff. Thank you very much for that, Matt. Now, I've finished my cocktail here. I've got about half an hour before I need to get to the airport, which means just enough time to get on the big wheel here. And this is almost it for Edie's COP28 podcast, because we're going to take a very short break now for 1 or 2 days, depending on how long COP runs on. But like all great trios, Matt, Sarah and I will be reuniting for one final episode of the show to wrap up COP28 once everything has concluded here in Dubai. So hopefully that final episode of the show will see us hailing the most successful COP in history with a clear and stated ambition to phase out fossil fuels. Fingers crossed for that one. So for one last time out here in Dubai, thanks very much for listening, everyone, and it's a goodbye from me. Goodbye.